I'm Rodger Citron. I'm a professor at Touro Law Center. This is a Touro Law Review Podcast. And tonight, our guest is my colleague, Professor Allison Caffarone. Professor Caffarone teaches evidence and other courses at the Touro Law Center. Tonight, we're going to be talking about George Orwell's 1984. And let me start by asking Professor Caffarone, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Professor Citron. Thanks for having me tonight. So I always feel like that's actually like the hardest question is tell me about yourself. I never actually know what to say to that. But so I've been at Touro Law School. I just finished my first year at the school. I've been in academia for a long time, over a decade, but had just come to Touro over the last year. Um, I before that, in my long time ago, I was at a big law in the city. Did white collar criminal defense. Um, I'm a mom, two kids, three dogs, born and raised on Long Island. Left for law school. That's about it.
Um, that that is a very concise yet broad, encompassing answer. So you're doing great. Um,
Okay.
the the uh, the next question, of course, when did you first read 1984?
Okay, so I was first assigned 1984 in high school, right? And I certainly read it or read at least most of it at that time. I'm not sure how closely I read it because having gone back and reread it, I certainly didn't remember a lot of it. But I think it was my junior year of high school. So it would have been like, I'm going to date myself, but it would have been in 1993 that I would have read it. And like I said, I didn't really, I don't think I remembered most of the book. Having gone back and reread it now, I think, just kind of overall big picture. But some of the things actually that prompted me to go back and read it again, I had completely not remembered whatsoever. What about you? You'd read it before, right? Or was this?
Yes, similar. I think that I'll just say that I was in high school before you were. Um, and same thing, assigned to read it at some point in high school. Um, Definitely read it then. Don't think I reread it between now and this year, but as we may talk about, I've read some other Orwell books. I'm actually a pretty big fan of the author, George Orwell. And um, I, interestingly, I feel the same way about it now as I did back then, which is that I didn't particularly enjoy reading the novel, although I think it's fascinating and there's so much to discuss. So let me, now that we've sort of, disclosed our prior histories with respect to the novel, let me ask this podcast was your idea, which delighted to do. Why did you want to do this podcast, or what made you read 1984?
Yeah. So, right, I guess, well, the current climate that we live in, I suppose, is the really short way to say that, right? But it's more because I think it's really hard these days to, I would say, make it through. I'm going to say a week, but I think it's probably 2 or 3 days, right? Without hearing somebody say, oh, that's Orwellian, or referring to Orwell, or referring to 1984, right? And and it was extremely interesting to me. It's not just, obviously I'm talking about in the political climate, but it's not just one side that refers to Orwell or refers to Orwellian, right? I mean, I think the first time I recall at the moment, like a few months ago, was when Vice President Vance brought it up and he was talking about with the German prosecutors, right? And he was saying, oh, this is Orwellian. And then I think it was like 2 or 3 days later, maybe not even. Um, I think President Trump had maybe implied or suggested or said that Ukraine was responsible for the Russian invasion, and the same thing came out then with people saying this is Orwellian, and then I started to see a bunch of quotes actually from the book coming out online and on social media, and one of the people that I remember responding to this suggestion by President Trump that about the Ukraine-Russian war, he had said, it was a congressman, he said, Putin started this war. I don't accept George Orwell's doublethink. Right. And I actually didn't even like I had not remembered the term doublethink. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like I need to go back and kind of revisit this book and reread it and examine it today. And look, that's something I do a lot with books that I either read or was supposed to have read in high school. I don't know that I was always the best student, and so I feel like, there are things that I should simply go back and re-examine and think about how I feel about them today. So that's kind of what made me think, all right, look, I think it's time for me to go back and read 1984, which by the way, I'm glad I did. And I'm glad that we had discussed doing this podcast, because now I went back and I reread the essay that I'm sure will come up later that we were talking about. And I started to read the book that you recommended that you had really liked. So I'm glad that this actually came up, because it's kind of opening my mind to a lot more Orwell than had been before.
Yeah, and you know, so even back when we were in high school, which I'll just politely say was back in the last century, um, right? The novel had this, it was this very important um, symbol, or right. In other words, we were years apart in high school. We went to high school in different states, and yet I'm guessing that the fact that it was assigned to us was a very common experience. But I think for both of us, it was if you want to understand the Cold War,
Right.
this is an important novel. In other words, if you want to understand what happened in the 20th century after World War II, this novel is important. And yet, here we are, more than a quarter century after we were in high school, and uh, the book still seems to have, right? It's very potent. Um, and as you pointed out, it's deployed or invoked on both sides of the political spectrum. That is, if you go back during the Biden administration, there were complaints that the government with in terms of how it's handling information about the pandemic, that was Orwellian in certain ways. And of course, the charge has been leveled again, now with President Trump back in office, and with one of the examples that you gave. Did well, let me ask, um, uh, so reading it now, reading it
Mhm.
today, um, do you think it's properly invoked or fairly invoked uh, for the current moment?
Okay, so I kind of want to answer this in I was going to say two parts. It might be more than two parts, right? Well, but one of the things that I thought was kind of so interesting about this is I keep thinking to myself, well, how would Orwell feel, right? Like if he heard everyone constantly saying today, well, this is Orwellian, right? This is Orwellian. And and I think that the reason that I'm thinking about that so much is because of how he thinks about language and politics, right? And how he kind of warns us that that language, you're going to start using something as shorthand, it's going to lose all its meaning. It can't possibly mean the same thing, to two completely different sides. Um, and so that to me is just interesting in and of itself, right? Because it's hard to answer, well, do I think that it's right to say, well, this is Orwellian, unless I kind of say then which side I'm coming from in saying, yes, I do think it's Orwellian, or no, I don't think it's Orwellian. So that's kind of where I would start, just by saying, I think the term can have lost meaning over the years. And so for me, going back though and reading 1984, um, and also reading the essay, what the essay which keeps the name keeps, is it like the English language in politics, I think is the essay maybe.
I think
Um,
that's close enough. I think
okay,
right.
right. Thinking
Well,
about that, I was kind of blown away with how much I think, yes, that those references are on point. Um, Only because, so look, and I went into the book probably looking for examples and things, right? Because I'm like, oh, everyone is throwing this around so often. But in having read it, I kept saying to myself as I'm reading it today, oh my goodness, yes, like in my head, I'm thinking, like, for example, this exact thing that just happened 2 days ago, or this. And I mean, from my politics, right? I look at the current administration, and that's where I would refer to it as being Orwellian. That's kind of where I'm coming from on this after having gone back and reread the book. I don't know how political we want to be about this, but yeah, I think it is on point that people use that term. I don't, what do you think? And I mean, I can get more specific, but
yeah. I think that um, the relationship between language and politics um, is really, really, this is the most obvious point, right? It's really, really important um, for Orwell and right the novel, right, and that's where the essay, it really is an extraordinary essay. And I remember in college taking a writing course, and I'm sure we read it within the first month. Um, and you know, it it's so right, it's so concise, it's so powerful because um, it right it combats or exactly what it's describing or opposing, right? In other words, it's so clear, it's uh, so grounded. Um, and so, and the novel, I think, is meant to, provide this world where, you know, truth has been perverted or obscured or perhaps even lost. Um, and so, uh, uh, one of the things that is interesting is that I think that point still holds, and yet technology is very different from the way he imagined it. Um, and you know, I don't think that whatever you think politically, at least the United States, or and even in other words, the way in which the technologies um, have evolved, um, it isn't this sort of overwhelming monolithic message that's sort of imposed upon us from the top down or from the government down, right? That was kind of, I think that was, Orwell's greatest fear or greatest concern, writing in the 1940s, and the novel was published in 1949. Um, and yet, even though we live in a world very different from what he imagined, there is still this concern about um, is there truth? Is there more than one truth? How do we know what's true? So I think I've answered your question. Um, Even if I haven't, there's certainly something there you can you can respond to.
yeah. So look, I think, I mean, obviously, right? With respect to, is there a truth? Is there more than one truth? What does language mean today? I guess I would kind of start with that idea where I know just, and again, regardless of where you come on the spectrum, whatever your beliefs will be, I knew that words today, I'll say, some of my neighbors and I have very different political leanings, right? Certain words, I think today, when I speak to them and when they speak to me, I think they mean extremely different things. For instance, I'm thinking of the word, patriot, American, law and order, like just terms that are, to me, have a very specific meaning and have a very specific truth. And I think they would say the exact same thing. And yet somehow we are at complete opposite. We do not see eye to eye. Is so and so, is such person a patriot? Is this are we is this the law and order administration? Whichever you want to do, and whichever side you fall on, um, there are two very, very different truths there. And I actually think that's not even so much that there are different, like that you can't trust facts anymore so much. I think even if you look at things through and say, okay, but here we have an objective list of facts, and we can both at least agree that these are facts that happened, I still think that the way from the top down, perhaps, language is being manipulated and changed leads people to very two different truths. That's where I would say one. The second thing that I think, though, is so interesting, with respect to some of what Orwell says in the essay, right, where he seems to be more concerned with the idea that, when you try to speak in vague terms, right, and you try to sound overly pretentious almost, that it alters the meaning, right, or that it takes the meaning away, that no meaning can therefore anymore exist, right? I think that's, of course, very true, but I also think that it's so true the opposite way too. If you like, so for instance, I'm thinking of our current president, right, of Donald Trump. I've kind of never seen a politician who speaks more bluntly, more simplistically, more to the masses, if that's how you want to say it. And yet I still think those same concerns about obscuring the truth and or being able to manipulate the truth and politics through language holds through, which I never necessarily would have thought it did, right? I think I would have always thought of it more where Orwell's talking about it, where you have to, if you can't really, give a word a definition, and it's much more vague and it's very much more up in the air, then you're able to do this so much more easily. But now I live today and I'm like, okay, but this actually works the other way too. I don't know if I'm articulating that well. I don't know if I'm making sense. But right. So if you go back and think kind of, if you use phrases that have no more meaning, I think that's kind of what Orwell was saying, right? If you take phrases that are used every day so often and they lose their meaning, and we kind of speak in this very roundabout way and almost this very inefficient way, and we do so on purpose. We being the people from above who want to control the thought. Um, and I think the idea is you do that so you can control thought, right? Because if there's not really any meaning in what you're saying, you can make it mean whatever you want, and you can make people think whatever you want. And to me, that made perfect sense. What I have a harder time with, which is what I think happens today, is that I think it's not in these very vague terms that are thrown around, or in this. I think it's very straightforward. I think it's very simplistic. I think it's very just here is what I'm saying. These words have definitive meaning. And yet I think the same is exactly true in what it's able to, how that language is still able to manipulate the truth.
Yeah, the idea that kept going through my mind as you were speaking was at some point, and I think it was in during his first term as president, there was sometimes people would say about Trump, I think as candidate and then as president, oh, uh, he means that figuratively, not literally. Um, and um, and sometimes that was true, but sometimes it really wasn't. And um, you've there you absolutely have identified something I think fascinating and true, which is that um, uh, there is a directness um, in many of the things that he says that is very, I think, compelling. Um, Certainly to people who support him, who voted for him, and so on. And that seems to right? That seems to be, if you will, inconsistent or doesn't accord with how Orwell thought that the future would look like, or what politics would be like in the future, coming out of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War and so on. Let me switch gears. I'm sure we'll come back to the politics piece. Let me do, because I teach law and literature. Why don't we do the literature piece? What did you think of the novel as a novel?
I'm not a huge fan of the novel as a novel. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it's obviously a fascinating world in which is created in the novel. I think if I wasn't reading it today, like I think that there's a reason why I didn't love it so much in high school. I think if it's not something that I was really able to kind of connect with today, that I wouldn't have I wouldn't necessarily tell someone, I think you should go read this. Like I think I enjoy it. I enjoy it. And I think it's interesting. I know you, maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know you think that I think you had mentioned to me that you didn't love it because it's, perhaps too political. That's not what my problem was with it, which is interesting because I don't always love when I'm any kind of media, whether it be a book, a television show, a podcast, whatever it may be. I don't always love when I'm feeling like I'm being bombarded with, right, with the conclusion that the author is asking me to reach. I think here I didn't have that big of a problem with it because I think that's why I went into it, like almost right to go back and see what was this all about. I mean, I think that with respect to the literature and the characters, I don't think any of the characters, the main protagonist of the book, are all that interesting. I'm not right. I mean, like I just and I also don't. I tend to, maybe this is just human nature, right? Usually, if I read something, if I watch something, whatever it may be, I want there to be someone that I can really connect with, right? Even if it's a person, even if they're, a person that's not supposed to be such a great person, but they have attributes, right? They have something about them that is draws me in or makes me connect with them. And I just don't really have that in this book. That's not how I feel about when reading it. And so I don't think that it's certainly not one of my favorite books. It's certainly not one of my favorite political books, actually. But yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll come back to the political books point, I hope. But because I'm curious what you do like in that vein. Um, yeah, and you fairly characterized my views. I think you know Orwell is just phenomenal at describing things, because he is direct, he's clear, he's vivid, and so um, when he describes sort of the sensations, if you will, or the experience, the sensory experience of what life is like in this society, I think it's phenomenal, right? It just seems so miserable. Um, the food is crappy. There's no real alcohol, right? It
Right.
in the apartment buildings, it's a little bit like the walls are a little bit, I think, either oily, right, or kind of like
Yeah.
it's like they're not really that, it's not that clean. They don't smell that great, and no one has any privacy, because everyone's sort of crowded, and so you know I think that he was really you know sort of projecting what life was like during World War II, and even post-war, right? Because England had been leveled in World War II, and projecting that into this is what it's going to be like forever. This is what it's going to be like in this horrific future. Um, uh, but it's so vivid that that was very engaging to me. The
He,
as an sorry, the as
no, no, please.
but as a novel, the point that you correctly, I think, characterized me as saying was, I think it's my favorite word in this context. It was tendentious. That is to say, the characters were sort of subservient to this sort of, political script that was meant to make a very, you know, powerful, perhaps obvious, criticism of totalitarianism. And then the last thing, and so that's why, you know, um, I don't know that I could have said that back when I was in high school, but I can say
Right.
it now. But I think it's what I was reacting to even back then. And then the last thing is, and I almost um, there is a part in his interrogation um, where after he's been uh, arrested, Winston's been arrested, and at a
Hmm.
certain point where he's sort of going head to head with his interrogator or interlocutor, um, that I thought that really had me. I really woke up for those 5 or 10 pages, um, where they're having this really, you know, blunt, direct, you know, conversation about uh, the society that the power in the society and what the intention is of those who 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 run the nation or who have power. And
Hmm.
that really that leaped out at me as fascinating. So if I was ever going to teach this novel, I would definitely, I wouldn't assign all of it, but I'd assign
Yeah,
the pages for sure. So yes,
that's so
those are my remarks.
okay. No, that's so interesting to me. So a few point, right? So a few things. I think where you started off with how his language just evokes these, vivid images, right? I mean, he does this so well. And I think it's one of the things that he's critiquing in other writers. He's right in other speakers just in general. He's kind of says, I think part of is like, look, if you can't get someone to see, if you're not evoking some kind of image in them, why are you using the words? What is even the point, right? Like try to and he does that so remarkably well. With respect to the characters, maybe you hit the nail on the head with I don't like about the characters. Maybe I feel like, right, that they're just kind of serving the overall conclusion that he watches us to reach, as opposed to actually being their own individual character. Maybe that has something to do with what I'm not with I don't love about it. Though, what I find so interesting, I like the, I prefer the beginning half of the book to the second
Mhm.
half of the book. So I prefer it before they get to when he's arrested and when he's interrogated. And for me, although I do think there are points in that interrogation where I agree with you that if you were going to teach it, I think that I'm not surprised you would pick those parts, but it certainly wouldn't be the parts where that stuck out to me the most as me saying I really found this book to be so I don't even know why enjoyable, enlightening maybe. But that could also be because of the times that I grew up and kind of how I've grown up with, for instance, just technology and surveillance and things that are around me that to me um, maybe have more that I think about in my everyday life, possibly. I don't know. That just makes it that I related to or enjoyed those parts better. Not
Oh,
sure.
yeah, yeah. Um, and see, I think you may be too young, and this will date me. There's a very famous television advertisement from the 1984 Super Bowl. I think it was a Microsoft ad. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. And one of the reasons why it's one of the all-time great Super Bowl commercials is that it sort of, you know, very much, draws on the idea of a totalitarian society. And of course, the premise of the ad is that Microsoft shatters that. And it's done so aesthetically creatively, um, that, uh, I that sort of why it's in, at least if you're in my generation, right? It's in the Hall of Fame of television advertisements, and I bring that up because um, uh, you know technology is pervasive. Surveillance is, you know, there's more than ever now than there was when we were growing up, and that's something that will only continue apace. Um, and yet, it. I still think the problem is not that you know power and technology and surveillance are monolithic, but rather everyone everywhere. Um, it's kind of like I, I'm thinking now of conversations I've had with Professor Laura Dooley, and right, like my problem is, oh, it's a postmodern problem. That is, there's too many images, there's too much. Um, that's what makes truth hard to discover, is that there's an abundance of images, ideas, words, texts, and
Mhm.
I'm sort of coming back to a point I think I made earlier about Orwell very much projects it as sort of monolithic and totalitarian. That is, that there will be no deviation from what the government wants you to think.
Right.
Um, anyway, um, uh, the there was I mentioned that one of my favorite Orwell books is his book about fighting in the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia. And did you or did you not have a chance to look at it? I wasn't sure from what you said before.
Yeah, so I got that email a few days ago, so I started reading it. So I'm in like chapter 3. I think I had never read it before. I wasn't even aware of it. What yeah, what why is that one of your favorites?
Yeah, I think that the Spanish Civil War, in and of itself, is kind of fascinating to me because um, it was kind of like, and I think it was under. There were some who I think who thought at the time who understood this is kind of like the preseason for World War II. That is, it was like, or a test case, if you will, between communism and fascism in Spain. But even apart from that, um, I just find his candor, that is, you know, what he describes, how he writes about um, conflict, and then even how he writes about, you know, the politics, um, not just the political conflict of the war, but the political conflicts even on the same side. Um, I just find it to be really, really interesting. And here, right, because it's not a novel, it it doesn't sort of all have to add up or run in the same direction thematically. Um, and so those are some of the reasons why I'm such a fan of the book. Um,
Yeah,
uh,
I wish I had been able to get further through it so I could talk with you about it. I can't. Um like I said, not even on chapter 3, I think. But I am certainly interested in finishing it. I'll let you know my thoughts after I've gotten a little further through. Um,
right. Was there anything else about the 1984 that you wanted to mention, discuss?
um Not necessarily, no, other than that, to the extent that say to the extent that our students listen to this, or I would just suggest the same thing that I do for myself, right? Even if students have read this book back in high school or whenever, I would suggest that people go back and reread it and think about and reflect on it and think about what it is that it means to them today, and if it has any bearing on what it means for them today, or what their thoughts are, because I feel like people can change so drastically and have different understandings, and I just think that's an important thing to do generally, but maybe particularly with this book. which is also, not one of my favorite books, but it's a pretty easy read and it's a fairly enjoyable read.
So glad that we had a chance to have this conversation because when you brought it up, the idea of doing the podcast, it turns out that, I had just finished rereading or was in the middle of rereading the novel too. And I'm so glad I had a chance to talk about it with someone who is similarly interested. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thanks for kind of indulging me in it and having me. I appreciate it.